A lot of concern about the reasons for their coming, or what their ethnicity really is. Do they come under the law of return? What their religion is? Do they need to be reconverted or converted or whatever? And Israelis love to argue about all kinds of issues like that. My solution to those problems would simply be like Abraham in the Old Testament: who's ever, with us is part of the group. Whoever doesn't want to be with us is not part of the group. And I wouldn't even be interested in all of those rabbinic sort of issues. To my mind, Abraham, I don't want to use that particular issue of circumcision, but if you remember, I think it's Genesis 17, Abraham circumcised his whole household. Everyone was traveling with him. It doesn't matter who. It's not that Abraham, God supposedly tells him to do that. Whether you should or shouldn't circumcise has nothing to do with my point. The point is that's a way of showing you're part of this particular community. But in the Bible, that is. So, but that's how I wouldn't ask anyone questions. It's tough enough to be part of that cultural community. Why would anyone want to question anybody? If you're with us, I'm talking about Israel, I would just say, as an Israeli, if I was one of them, you're with us, and if you're not, you're not. And if you notice the casualties in the recent war in Lebanon, I follow the casualties pretty closely, because I hook on to all the websites of the Middle East. If you want to ever do that, the right-wing website is Sedka.com. This is a Russian website in Israel, and they know all the secret intelligence stuff from everywhere. The only problem with that is they sometimes go way overboard and exaggerate to the extreme, but that's a right-wing Russian immigrant website in Israel who know all the intelligence stuff. And then there's, I think it's either JerusalemPost.com or JPost.com. I think it's Jerusalem Post, which is English language paper. And then there's Haaretz.com, another English language version of their Hebrew newspaper that they have. And then there's Ynet.com, which is the third newspaper in Israel that have an English-speaking, if you're interested. I'm just interested, I follow it, I bang it up. I've got Al Jazeera even on my thing, bang theirs up there. See what's going on, you can get it at aljazeera.com. It's no big deal. I follow this stuff. So you looked at the casualties in the recent Lebanon war. So sad to see, these young boys who have just come from Russia, just gotten settled in Israel. I would say a third of the casualties looked to me like they were Russian Jewish immigrants of recent arrival. I would just imagine how the parents of those boys feel, those young men. You say, well, what about the Lebanon people on the other side? Well, yeah, one can feel things, but, they don't sort their problems out. They ask for these things, they provoke. And so it's hard to generate an awful, great pity in that particular situation. No one in Israel wants to go to war with these people. They just want to be left alone. You people, do your thing, but leave us alone. But they're not going to leave them alone, so these wars occur. Whether that was a necessary one or wasn't necessary, I can't judge those things. But you say you're misplacing your pity. Well, again, when you see them marching on the street and they're using all the fascist symbols, and when you see what's the group in Hezbollah and marching with goose steps and so on and so forth, and you see they've just taken the swastikas and turned them into something else, and they're doing exactly the same stuff with the same kind of signs, with the same everything, and the Persian, Iranian premier saying the same kinds of things, you know what they're up to. I don't have to imagine, so it's hard to feel pity. And the Israelis were not bombing the Christian areas at all. They never bombed the Christian areas. None on the newspapers make like they're bombing everywhere. No, they just bombed the Hezbollah areas where they were hiding out in strongholds and in with you know, civilian populations and so on purpose. But I'm not for bombing anybody if you don't have to, and I wish one didn't have to. But you see the kind of equipment that they're bringing into those places, missiles and everything else. And if you don't do it, you're a dead man. So it's a sad situation, obviously, and we're going through the same thing in Iraq ourselves, and we didn't go in with sufficient force, and now the whole thing is chaotic, and who knows what the final result of all that will be, and I don't want to try to evaluate it right or wrong. It's none of my business to place blame, but they just didn't do it the way it had to be done if they were going to do such a thing, and it was just a very poor plan. But I think they imagined that the population was just going to greet them like liberators. That was their mistake. They just didn't understand the mentality of the Middle East. They thought they were going to be greeted like liberators. They wouldn't have to do anything. Everybody would be so happy that they then sort themselves out and get down to business and not make a big deal of it. But they were way off the mark in their minds. Anyway, Israel's got the same thing that they have to do. And I see these young Russian kids who are coming from these places. The old generation, they're used to it. But I watched. They put the pictures of the casualties in there. In that last war, and it was really, even I could feel was really, I mean, half of them I don't even think were Jewish guys. They were all mixed, so Russian something or other. So in Russia, the 3 million or so, 2.5 million, 3 million, they don't know exactly how many are or aren't. It's a very mixed up situation in Russia as far as background goes, a lot of intermarriage and so on. So it's not clear who is really Jewish, who isn't really Jewish, whether they're leaving for this reason or that reason. But anyway, they want to go live in Israel, and they want to be part of that situation there, and they want to, you know, undergo that sort of threat and so on. I wouldn't question anybody. You know, I wouldn't question anybody if I was the authorities. All that is very childish. All right, so now we have some material here. We did Herzl, and we looked at some of the supporters of Herzl, like Nordau, and the American Brandeis, who sounds like a big supporter of Herzl. And you could see that Brandeis, being a politically minded, he is a labor lawyer originally, would actually find something in Herzl to identify with. But now we find some people who don't like Herzl, who think Herzl is a well, Johnny-come-lately, shall we say? By the way, if you're interested in labor Zionism, the Zionism of the kibbutz that I'll probably take a look at some point, their big intellectual guru, if you want to call him that, is Aaron David Gordon, 1856 to 1922. You'll find him on page 370 something or other. We might have a look at him if we have time, but I call him to your attention. The man who is really the anti-Herzlian and the person who leads the struggle, if you like, intellectually against someone like Herzl and political Zionism. There's nothing wrong with him, is Ahad Ha'am. I don't know if I can find what page Ahad Ha'am is on. Oh, you got my thing here? Good, good. Thanks very much. I don't know what page what page is Ahad Ha'am? Can you find it? 248. There's a lot of material from Ahad Ha'am here. I don't know if we have time to look at it all. I want to do Weitzman and Ahad Ha'am today if I can, because they're the same mindset. Maybe we can bleed over in the next period with Weitzman and Jabotinsky. We'll end up with Jabotinsky and some of his like-minded people. 1856 to 1927. So you know, he has a much longer lifespan than Herzl has. When was Herzl born? I think he's probably, Nordau is, by the way, if you go to Tel Aviv, to modern Tel Aviv, you'll see all, Nordau's a little older than Adam by about 5 years, but, and dies about 5 years earlier, but Herzl, I think he's got him arranged here more or less by date of birth, but not with Herzl. Herzl's 1860. So he's 4 years younger than Adam, and he dies about 25 years before him. So, you know, the tragedy for Herzl, Herzl is from Hungary. Herzl is one of these people who was like the family that you saw. So, Freud's people came from Hungary too and moved down to Vienna. Remember the guy with the legal background goes to Vienna? Yeah. What? What's up? You got a question?
No, sorry, I was scratching my head.
Oh, okay. In the movie, one of the early brother, you know, the early brother who loves the cousin is goes to Vienna, and she visits him in the hotel room in Vienna. I lived in Vienna a little bit when I was your age. When I was on the road back in the late 50s, and as I think I told you, you could get in those days a room for 60 cents a night and a Wiener Schnitzel for about $1. You know, Europe on $5 a day wasn't even the thing. It was Europe like around $2.50 a day. That's what it was like. And, you know, but there was no one on the road much in those places when I was down there. I didn't even know it, but I was doing some writing, and some people sent me to this village up in the mountains. And I'd never even heard of Herzl at that time, even though I'd been to college and went to an Ivy League school, supposedly was well educated. I didn't know anything. This place, the village I went to for a couple of months in the autumn, in the outside of Salzburg in the mountains, was called Altasse. And I later found out that's where Herzl used to do his writing. I didn't have any idea, you know, I never knew it at that time. And it's really interesting to me to know that now. But I had no idea at that time when I was a young, you know, 21, 22 years old, 21 or so, that was any significant place whatsoever in anyone's life or biography or anything like that. It was a lovely little place, I must say. There's a little place down near the river, was called Badassee, where people used to go. Bad means bath, which is where people used to go to take the baths, but this was further up in the mountains. Alt means higher up. Altasse, it was a little village. I can still picture it because it had apple trees and apples on the ground and grass and, you know, totally alpine sort of setting. Absolutely lovely little place. But they all went to Vienna, and I went to Vienna, and some of the scenes in that movie, I know, I could see, looked like places. I don't know if they were filmed in Vienna, but they looked like places I knew from Vienna. One of the cafe scenes that they show him in the first sequence meeting his cousin in and talking about changing their name or whatever. That looked just like one of the famous cafes in Vienna people used to go to and sit around, intellectual cafes. In those cafes, they would always have newspapers. You have a newspaper on a wooden sort of reader staff, and you could sit in those cafes all morning long and read the newspaper, do whatever you wanted. That's the way Vienna used to be. It was called gemütlich, cozy. But of course now the prices have skyrocketed about 100 times what I used to what I used to know back in the good old 50s and 60s, before the Vietnam War and the oil crisis produced the world that you know. And I think those are the two big events that produced the world that you know. Anyway, they all went down there, and Herzl was one of these people, so he's Hungarian, and as we saw, I think we mentioned earlier, his son committed suicide, and his or was it the daughter? Anyway, they had a son and daughter. One committed suicide, and the other died shortly thereafter, and they had just brought their bodies to Israel recently. I don't know what happened to his wife, but most of their people in their family were killed. Freud got away to England right before the beginning of the war. Another one whose originally his background came from Hungary. They were in Vienna, went to the University of Vienna, and so on, practiced medicine in Vienna. So a lot of these people were in that world. Of course, this is the movie was people stayed in Budapest in Hungary, but that world was all part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. So as you see, if Herzl hadn't died so young, for the strenuous work that he did, I think Zionism could have achieved its goals more clearly in an earlier period. That's just my suspicion, but you can't prove those things. That's what would have happened if Lincoln hadn't been assassinated or something like that. I mean, I don't consider the Kennedy person a very significant person. I feel sorry for anyone who's shot down like a dog, obviously. No one would like that. I know that the young people in America consider Kennedy like some god, but I didn't know anything that he did or achieved that was of any particular interest or noteworthiness. So I don't consider that the same sort of turning point as the Lincoln situation in America. So you often wonder what would have happened if someone hadn't been killed in this way. I think Teddy Roosevelt was another one I mentioned to you. Anyway, he was born Ahad Asher Zvi Ginsburg, and he's further east, you see, in Russia, Ukraine. So it would be a different outlook. It wouldn't be as modern as the Budapest people, the Vienna people, the German people, the Herzl-type people, Nordau in England, Brandeis in America, and so on. There wouldn't be a modern outlook. They would be more, more like the ghetto mentality, if you want to call it that. More Eastern, not liberated, not very aware of the modern world in that sense. Someone like Ben Yehuda would be someone who went west and did study in the West, so he actually was probably pretty modern, even though his return to Hebrew was, I think, an intellectual process that he chose to do in an intellectual fashion. Ukraine in 1856. He tried to go to West, but finally to Vienna, Berlin, places like that, according to our introduction here, but finally moved to Odessa. I've been hearing that people who want to invest money at the moment, that Odessa is the big place to buy real estate today. For people who know about these things. I just heard that from my son who's in the Fashion Network, and apparently there are people in that world that are investing in Odessa. Why would people invest in Odessa? What's in Odessa that's so interesting? Remember, Pinsker came from Odessa. Odessa is the Black Sea port of the Russians. Now I think it's part of the Ukraine. I don't think it's in Russia anymore. But it's supposed to have a very marvelous climate and very Mediterranean-like, very balmy and so on. And it's just apparently a very, very beautiful location and place. So it is pretty modern at this point vis-a-vis where he would have come from. And that is Ahad Am. So he knows about the Haskalah, things of that kind, and he knew about the Hibat Zion movement. That's on page 255. And but what he was really interested in was Judaism. Judaism as such. I don't really see him as a Zionist as such. He's interested in the whole problem of Reform Judaism and integrating Zionism and other things into that. And therefore, the movement that he represents comes to be called cultural Zionism. Comes to be called cultural Zionism. So you see now, what is the difference of cultural Zionism, of political Zionism? Then the others would be labor Zionism communism applied to the Holy Land. Political Zionism would also be practical Zionism, but these labor Zionism would be represented by people. I guess we have Ben-Gurion in this book somewhere. Ben-Gurion, who helped found the state, but they come out of the socialist kibbutz movement. They're actually, they go to Israel as pioneers in kibbutz, which is the Jewish or Hebrew word for kibbutz, means to collect. It's a collective. It's a collective, like in the communist Eastern Europe. Collective farm, collective agricultural community. In Israel, there are several kinds of these collectives, and they all belong to different. They used to be very important before really capitalism took over the last 25 years, and you have the Silicon Valley type of mentality permeating a lot of areas around Tel Aviv. By the way, people who saw Tel Aviv, who had seen Odessa, even non-Jews, but Russians and people like that, like for instance, the famous, I don't know if you remember, but there was an actor in Hollywood called Akim Tamarov. He came from Odessa, and he said when he saw Tel Aviv, he thought he was seeing Odessa. The architecture, the way it's laid out, everything like it, reminded him apparently of Odessa. So you have basically a lot of different parties. They all have their kibbutz movement. There's more left-wing, center, but they're all left-wing, but there's extreme left-wing, center left-wing, right center left-wing, all that sort of thing. And you'd have to know the whole history of Israel to know these things. But one of the more right-wing sort of groups who were still left-wing didn't like the kibbutz movement. So they founded something called a moshav. So now, kibbutz everything is owned in common. You have the leaders in the community, they're still there. They're not as important in society as they used to be. As I told you, the Silicon Valley generation, others have taken more of the center stage for the economy in Israel. The kibbutz movement used to make up the backbone of the Israeli army. I mean, you couldn't get people who were called yeshiva bookers. Of whom we may have some around this campus someplace. People who sat and studied in yeshivas and didn't do much else than that. You couldn't get yeshiva bookers to really, do much in an army. Now you do a little bit. Some of the religious settlements, mostly in the occupied territories as they're called, those are mostly religious settlements, a lot of them, where religious people have gone under some economic benefit situation for them, and their children are pretty turned on sort of people, religiously speaking, and they go into the army now too. Can I see them? They all be wearing little caps. We used to call them in this country kappa, a yarmulke, but in Israel they're called kippahs. Israel they're called kippahs. And you can always tell if a guy's walking around with a machine gun and a kippah, he's usually from a religious kibbutz or something like that. I can't speak for the women. I don't know what they'd be wearing in similar situations. Or if they got the sit-sits sitting, hanging out. You know what sit-sit are?
I've seen them camouflaged.
Sit-sit are the fringes that the religious people wear under their clothing. You might have seen it in that movie, The Chosen, if you saw if you read the book, of course you know it. They talk a lot about sit-sit in that movie, in that book. But the movie would have people wearing sit-sit, which are, at one point, they take the Old Testament so literally, some of these people, that at some point, and you should have them as for frontlets before your eyes, and something about the fringes of your garments or something like that. I can't remember, but it's in Deuteronomy or Leviticus or one of those books. And you can look it up, and that's what it's based on. It should always have these sit-sits because it says something like that in the Old Testament. And that's why a lot of them wear the side curls. Before frontlets, don't ask me what the language originally meant because I haven't studied it that deeply, but that's where the side curls come from. If you've noticed, some of the religious people wear the side curls. more Hasid or others. And I know I lived among Arabs when I was in the Middle East mostly. I find them more, so I did Islamic studies, and I know pretty much. My first book was Islamic Law in Palestine and Israel. It was published by E.J. Brill in Leiden in 1976, I think, maybe 78, I don't recall. It's a pretty good book. I'm amazed that I could write such a thing. In any event, that was what, I did a lot of my early work in Islamic law and stuff like that. And I did Middle East studies. But I lived among the Arabs, and so I knew what they thought. And they would always call the religious Jews curlies for that reason. Oh, there's a curly, they would say. You know, that in English they would say, because from the mandate they knew that much English. Oh, you know, the curlies are okay. The curlies are okay. They're not a threat. You know, they didn't mind the curlies because they didn't present any threat to them. They knew they were weak, at least physically weak, and they weren't going to ever confront them on anything. So they knew that was not an issue. In terms, I'm talking about weak in terms of not being able to defend themselves. Anyway, that's as far as the so-called occupied territories or West Bank concerns, the kind of settlements that you presently have there, or some of them are actually suburb towns, not settlements as such. But people like to use the language settlement so they can make it look as if it's a temporary thing and that the people are going to have to leave there sometime or whatever. So the settlement idea is deep-seated in the political consciousness of people who want to make them leave. And there's going to come a crunch at some point, and it's going to be real nasty when it comes. That's all I can tell you. I don't know what the outcome will be, but people have spent their whole life, and there's not happiness for what happened in Gaza. There is no happiness in Israel. Read the newspapers and you'll see there is no happiness for that. And that is considered to have been a government disaster. And the people were badly treated who left, and they were never compensated properly, and they're living in temporary housing here and there, and there's a lot of stored up bitterness. And should anyone try to remove any of those people from some of the so-called settlements, I can assure you there will be civil war. It will not be the way it happened in Gaza. And the world doesn't understand that Israel has its own political strains there. And people have spent their whole life in these places developing them and so on. They're not going to go without a fight, that's all I can tell you. I mean, I'm talking about a fight, internal fight in Israel. No government will be able to survive that. Once they start firing on each other, no government will be able to survive that. So whatever the world is pressing them to do, it's not going to happen so easily. It's not going to be done so easily, because the problem is the government will fall. And so whoever makes commitments like that and tries to carry them out, they've all taken the lesson from Gaza, what happened in the last year or two in Gaza, and nobody is going to go peacefully in any of these places. At least that's what the sounds like when you're reading between the lines of what you're seeing. So these are things that are not reckoned, that people don't reckon. But in any case, the kibbutz was the backbone of the army in the early days, because those were the people who went in their late 1800s, mostly in early 1900s, 1905. A lot of them were founded 1910. They drained the swamps, got rid of the malaria in the Galilee, around the Sea of Galilee. A lot of kibbutzes, very big, wealthy kibbutzes now, were founded there. It's a very tropical climate there. They drained the swamps and so on, got rid of the mosquitoes and stuff like that. A lot of them paid the price in malaria and stuff for having done that as pioneers. And so their children were brought up very physically, not a lot of intellectual background. Socialism was pumped into them basically, but nothing else. And so they were very secular-minded, very socialist-minded, but no religiosity. And they're the people that made up the backbone of the army. If you remember Yitzhak Rabin, he's a perfect example of that kind of person. Actually, his family came from America originally. But he was, you know, if you ever saw the movie Exodus, any of you see the movie Exodus? Well, the character, the hero of Exodus, that character is based on Yitzhak Rabin as a younger officer in the army. That's who Leon Uris was the writer who covered World War II, I think, wrote some movies, novels about World War II, and then got into the birth of the state of Israel. So and Yitzhak Rabin did look like anybody in the world. He didn't look particularly Jewish as such, if you can think of a Jewish stereotype. So that's who he was supposed to be, and of course the other one, his uncle, his rabid extremist uncle in that movie, if you've seen the movie, is supposed to be Menachem Begin, the leader of the Irgun or the Underground or things like that, which is a so-called terrorist organization or whatever. But you see, Begin wasn't really much of a terrorist, because the minute Jimmy Carter kissed him on the cheek and asked him to do this, that, and the other thing, he couldn't wait to do it, and ended up getting a Nobel Peace Prize with Carter and Sadat and so on. So a lot of people, well, that was not really a terrorist person, Begin. He was just play acting like a Mussolini person might do. He wasn't a serious person. Netanyahu's a serious kind of person like that, because Netanyahu's father was Jabotinsky's personal secretary. You have to know these things to know where people are coming from. They don't like Netanyahu. His father, when Jabotinsky died in 1940 or so, he was thrown out of Palestine by the British because he was too extreme. Netanyahu's father came to America, started teaching here, and I ultimately encountered him up at Cornell University, which is where Netanyahu was brought up, places like that, because his father was a professor, and his work, he's still alive, the father, and his work is on the, I forget what the title of it has to do with the Inquisition in Spain. He works on the Inquisition in Spain. That's his field of his research, the father. But he's probably in his 90s now, 80s to 90s. He's a very old man, but he interviewed me for a job at Cornell, as I think I told you, back when I was just doing my doctorate. He didn't like me. I didn't get the job anyway, which is why you see me standing here. But I did encounter Netanyahu's father at that time. And then he interviewed me in a cafe in Jerusalem, because that's where I was writing my dissertation on the Islamic law in Palestine and Israel. But in any event, to go back to this kibbutz movement, the Israeli army and these left-wing people like Rabin and Ben-Gurion and so on and so forth. Peretz in the present government is someone like that, but he and Moshe Dayan with the eye patch is another one who was on one of those kibbutzes around the Galilee. His parents helped settle that kibbutz around the Galilee, and he came out of that, and he's just a pure military man by the time he's done with an interest in archaeology. But Sharon now. Sharon comes out of the kibbutz movement too. These are all left-wingers. You say, well, he's a right-winger. Oh, well, not originally. Originally, he's out of the left-wing kibbutz movement, but his father broke with that left-wing kibbutz movement. All these people have fathers, you see, and you have to see the people within the context of where they're coming from. And his father went into the Moshav movement, which is different than the kibbutz movement. Moshav movement is you own your own house, you own your own fields, you take care of your own agricultural activity, and you only have to do with the other members of the Moshav by cooperating in the equipment that you use. The equipment is owned by everybody, the tractors, all that sort of thing. But you are responsible, and the Moshav probably markets your produce or whatever, but you're responsible for what you produce. So it mixes a little bit of private ownership in with collectivism. So there are so Moshav is a little intermediate thing, and that's what Ariel Sharon's father moved into, and he was brought up in that atmosphere. So he's already, so what does he become? He becomes a big landowner down in the Negev desert. He has a big ranch. No one in Israel has a ranch, but when he got powerful and everything, he got some American and other people, financiers to fund him, and he bought himself a big property down there where he raised cattle and stuff. But his background is still from the agricultural background of the Moshav. But that's why he's different, and then, of course, that's why he can swing back and forth the way he's done. People think he's a right-winger, but in fact he isn't. He can go back and forth because he has a double background there. He's on the right-wing side of the labor movement, but he's still considered a left-winger in Israel. This has to do with Israel. Okay, so you have all those kinds of things going on. But for people like Ahad, he wanted Israel to be a cultural center. Not Israel, but he wanted a cultural center to encourage Jewish learning, Jewish scholarship, you know, renewal of Judaism and so on and so forth. He didn't really want or was not interested in a state. And that's the difference between Ahad and Herzl. Herzl sees the need for a state. And that doesn't mean Herzl's a big, giant cultural person. Herzl was a writer. Herzl did write fiction. But his Jewish learning was probably meager. And for someone like Ahad, if you've ever been in these atmospheres, I know, I go to all these conferences, I know what it's like. You know, if you get someone who's been trained as a yeshiva booker from the time they're 5 years old, has been studying the Talmud and the Torah every day of their life for 50 years and so on, and then you come as a westernized sort of outsider, I mean, the contempt they have for you is so massive you can't even imagine it. So there are these divisions within the people itself if you're not trained in the way they're trained and so on. So Ahad would come out of that environment. That was one of the problems. Mendelssohn could straddle the two, but you see, Mendelssohn's children couldn't. And so you either get westernized or you're like in one of those things in Pakistan, one of those madrasas, where people are only learning about Islam. That's all they're learning. Okay, so here we have an essay, 1904, Flesh and Spirit. And he's interested in body and soul, nephesh. He's talking about the soul. 257. It's true that early Jewish life there were Nazarites who observed certain of the outward practices of asceticism. They've misspelled Nazarite. It should be Nazirites. So he's interested, so far we can't see. He's just talking about Jewish intellectual things. 258. It was not till the period of the Second Temple that political asceticism found expression in the life of the Jewish state. He knows about the Essenes, so he knows his scholarship to some extent. The Essenes gave up political life in despair. Bottom of that, 258. Turned their backs on incurable corruption, withdrew into the wilderness to live out individual lives in purity and holiness. Yeah, he's right in a way. The political asceticism of the Essenes had much influence on the general trend of thought. Did not have much influence. Well, he forgot that it produced Christianity, so I don't know what he's talking about. But anyway, we've now found the Dead Sea Scrolls, which are supposed to be Essene documents, and if that's withdrawing from politics, then you must be dreaming, because these people are waiting for the final apocalyptic war against all evil on the earth, and they're not withdrawing from anything. They're actually very aggressive and militant, which is one of the contradictions in Dead Sea Scroll research that I cover in my classes. In any event, it was not to them, top of 259, but to the Pharisees that the people looked to for instruction and leadership. And the Pharisees represented the prophetic conception of Judaism with its unification of body and soul. Well, you know, I have contempt for all this kind of writing, I have to be honest with you. I mean, this is so sort of pseudo-intellectual. I mean, the Pharisees don't represent anything about the unification of body and soul. This is only in his imagining. And he only is praising the Pharisees because they gave birth to Rabbinic Judaism. And Rabbinic Judaism is what the Romans allowed the Jews to practice after the fall of the temple. And that was the Pharisee party that was willing to live with foreign power. So obviously if you're a Pharisee, you're going to be willing to live with foreign power forever. And so obviously he's not interested in a political state. You know, this is not the Maccabeans. This is not, so you can trace these strains all the way through. And you can always find, if someone is into Rabbinic Judaism, which is fine, nothing wrong with it, you can be sure that they're not going to do anything to oppose Hitler. And it's going to be left to the Zionist organizations to fight in the Warsaw Ghetto. You say, how do you know all this, Eisenman? You just know it by, you just know it. You either know what's going on among this crazy people or you don't. Just like from your background, you know what your people may be and so on and so forth. It's a knee-jerk thing, you just know. You know what to expect from people. So who's going to give up their lives in the Warsaw Ghetto? The left and right-wing Zionists. They're the ones who are going to do it. The others just going to be transported. And that's the objection to Herzl. You see, he's like one of these people who wants to do something. He doesn't want to just wait and see what's going to happen, or for God to do something, or so on and so forth. He wants to do something. But you see, the difference between Herzl and people like Ahad Am and Weitzman is his disciple. Weitzman revels in the fact that they defeat Herzl at the Zionist congresses. He's overjoyed to defeat Herzl, and so we taught Herzl a lesson. Yeah, they killed him in effect, broke his heart. Yeah, but they're the losers because of the fact that they didn't feel the pressure of time that Herzl felt. Now, maybe Herzl wouldn't have been able to do anything. I happen to think he would have done more than them. And that he was already on the way to doing a lot when he died, I think, primarily of a broken heart, I think. So on. You say, well, he lacked spiritual stamina. Well, that may be true. He got a quick idea, and when things went against him, he cracked, perhaps you might want to say. But some of his own people helped him crack, which is, you say, well, you've got to be stronger than that. Well, it's easy to say, but it's not always possible to be stronger than a certain amount of strength. Anyway, here's, some of you have taken my classes, some of you haven't. You see, anybody who follows the rabbinic form of teaching and what I would call the rabbinic, I don't like to use this term, I'll be criticized, but I don't have a better term, propaganda. People think I'm hard on Christianity. I'm as equally hard on Judaism and Islam, so don't think I'm like one-sided in this kind of thing. You say, well, you just don't like anything. That's not true. You see some of the things I like, and it's pretty obvious. It doesn't matter what I like. You say, well, why don't you cover over what you like? Well, I don't think you can cover over what you like, and I don't think you should. The students can make their determination. They don't have to follow what you like, but you can't disguise you like something and you don't like it. So, I mean, when you teach, you'll show what you like and don't like too, and that'll be great. That's what you should do. And the students can make up their own minds. Anyway, you see, the propaganda, and I know the word that I can call it, of the rabbis, since they are the Pharisee teachers. The propaganda is we saved Judaism. That without us, Judaism wouldn't have survived, and so on and so forth. Well, that's probably true. I mean, I don't personally deny that. So therefore, since they're descendants of the Pharisee party, they praise the Pharisee party. So he's dismissing the Essenes here as unimportant. And now we see from the Dead Sea Scrolls that they are very important. And their contribution is really quite massive. And I don't think there would be any Islam without the Dead Sea Scrolls. I don't think there'd be any Christianity without it. Not that Christianity represents what the scrolls represent, because Christianity is inverted, turned into its mere opposite by Pauline teachers who studied with the Essenes, probably, and I think that's pretty clear because he uses all the language of the Dead Sea Scrolls. He knows the scrolls, but he hates he's a bit like a Ahad Am. He hates the scroll type people, and he's more into the Roman Empire ideology, and so he reverses everything. He turns their ideas against themselves. I don't have time to tell you how, but if you read my books, you'll see how he reverses everything that you find in the Dead Sea Scrolls. Paul is a Pharisee to some extent, as he says. I was born, I studied under the Pharisees. Yeah, he has a Pharisee mindset, but Christianity is the other side of the coin to Phariseeism. Phariseeism and Rabbinic Judaism, rather, or maybe the other side of the coin, Rabbinic Judaism developed from about the 2nd century to the 6th century. The early church fathers are functioning from about the 2nd century to the 6th century. And basically the only difference is that one are observing the law and the other aren't. And that's basically the difference between them. I mean, there's a lot of other differences that come out of Hellenistic thinking and Neoplatonism and allegorical interpretation like Philo of Alexandria. But basically the difference is one is pro-law, the other is anti-law. And the Phariseeism becomes pro-law with a vengeance because it adds to the law with the oral law and the traditions of the fathers and onward and build a fence around the Torah, so you have to then have other laws to make sure you don't accidentally incur upon the Torah and so on and so forth. So then you get into all the laws of kashrut. Kashrut is purity regulations, particularly regarding food, kosher, kashrut. So you have to have separate knives and forks, so you don't inadvertently, incur some pollution somewhere. Separate plates. Don't mix milk and meat, and so on and so forth. I don't believe they followed those things in the Second Temple period. I don't see anything to do with those things at all. That's all comes from building a fence around the Torah and the oral law, the Mishnah, and so on, after the fall of the temple. You say, well, where do they get it from? Well, one little word, one little phrase in the Old Testament. You shall not boil a kid in its mother's milk. That's it. And then they take that and they develop this whole huge system. That's not the Old Testament. That's what they do after the fall of the temple in the rabbinic school. In any event, the point is that if you're a descendant of that way of thinking, which is nothing wrong with it, they're not doing any harm to anyone. I'm not saying that they're bad people or that they mean harm to anyone or that they are trying to hurt anyone. They're not. They just want to be left to their activity to carry on their studies in the way they carry them on and so on. But you see, then you think that that is the best form of Judaism. See, he says, the Pharisees, it was not to them, but to the Pharisees that people look for instruction. And so you always hear from the Rabbinic Judaism, of course the Pharisees are the enemies in the New Testament, in terms of the picture of Jesus in the Gospels, arguing with the Pharisees and the Sadducees and so on. But I'm not sure, as I try to explain in my classes, and you people take my other class on historical Jesus, know that I think the Pharisee use in the Gospels is symbolic use to some extent, maybe not always, but to some extent for the James party in early Christianity, the people making problems over legal issues. That it's a code word, if you want to call it that, so it doesn't necessarily mean the Pharisees that we're talking about always. In any case, as you'll see, the Pharisees like to portray themselves as the popular party in Judaism of the Second Temple period, and that's what he's picked up here. But I don't think they were. And if you read your Josephus carefully enough, you'll find that the people never listened to what the Pharisees want to do. For instance, the Pharisees are against the Maccabees. For instance, the Pharisees want the people in 37 BC to open the gates to Herod. Gates of Jerusalem, to open the gates of Jerusalem to Herod and his Roman-sponsored army. The people don't do that, they resist. In 63 BC, when Pompey besieges Jerusalem, he has Pharisee help. And the Pharisees slaughter the other party more than the Roman troops do. That's all in Josephus. And the people are obviously behind the people resisting in the city of Jerusalem when Pompey comes and takes Jerusalem in 63 BC. And then finally, in the uprising against Rome in 66 to 70 AD, the Pharisees want to go out. They're called the Peace Party in Josephus. So nothing on the peace. I'm just trying to explain why the Pharisees are not the popular party that they advertise themselves to be. Because you have to judge by what the people do. They go out again, invite the Roman army into the city. But the people resist and destroy that Roman army. Josephus himself is a Pharisee. All those desirous of peace, and most of them are what would be considered to be, in that context, traitors. And for instance, Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai, founder of rabbinic, so this is stuff you never hear. You'll never hear any rabbi tell you this. And you'll never hear any of these people like Ahad or people like that talk about these things. They've all got the propaganda line. There's nothing wrong with it, but it isn't true, that's all. Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai, since I'm old now, I don't mind saying these things. Nobody else ever said them very much, so might as well say them sometime. Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai, I've never met a Jewish person in my whole life who ever called Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai a traitor, but he is. What's the heroic moment in the Talmud of Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai? He has himself smuggled out of Jerusalem in a coffin. That was the only way you could get out of Jerusalem in those days, because the Zealots had control of the city and the people supported the Zealots, not him. They resisted to the end. And I'm not saying it's good. I'm not saying, I'm just trying to get the history down. Be fair to these people, not to destroy the sacrifices they made. And then the Talmud says, he had an arrow shot into Vespasian, the Roman commander's camp, saying, Rabbi Yochanan is one of the emperor's friends. This is the future conqueror of Jerusalem, destroyer of the temple and the city, and the builder of the Colosseum, and so on and so forth, with money they took from the temple. As I told you in the early part of this course. How is that heroic? That's what the Rabbinic Judaism, that's the founding moment of Rabbinic Judaism, where he gets the academy from Vespasian at Yavne, sometimes called Yavne, well, I'll just do it like this. B's are B's, Y's are J's. To study Judaism. That's what he gets, and he applies the Messianic prophecy to Vespasian. You've heard about the world ruler prophecy. It's in Josephus. He says that the thing that most moved our young men to revolt against the Romans was the prophecy that the world ruler would come out of Palestine. That's Numbers 24:17. Star will rise from Jacob, a scepter to rule the world. I don't take these prophecies personally very seriously myself, but they did in those days. He said that's what most moved, so the revolt against Rome was a Messianic uprising. In any event, to show where he stood, Rabbi Yochanan says, you are the world ruler that will come out of Palestine to rule the world. You, Vespasian, before Nero is killed, and before Vespasian fights the other generals to take over the empire. And that's one of the things that encouraged Vespasian to do it. Because being superstitious and so on, like Roman commanders were, when he saw these Jewish prophets all telling him that he was the one that was going to do this thing, as they obsequiously played up to him, he was encouraged to do this. That's not the only reason, I'm sure, but it's one of the things that encouraged him. In any event, what would you call that? Treating with the enemy and saying the conquering general is going to take over applying your most precious prophecy to his destruction of your people? Oh, well, that's the most cynical, traitorous thing you could possibly do. That's celebrated among Jews everywhere as the founding moment of Rabbinic Judaism. Well, I don't want to get into arguments with fellow Jews and so-called my people or whatever, but, because you're never going to win these arguments, they're going to hate you for it. So I just try to keep it quiet, but it's my last term here, so I don't mind saying it. But the fact of the matter is that is not heroic, in my view. That's not what I call heroic. It may be wise, it may be discretion, it may be the proper, if you're going to lose, you might as well get something out of it or whatever. But that's not, I'm glad I wasn't there, because I wouldn't have known what to do myself in situations like that. I don't want to heap abuse on it, but I won't celebrate that as a heroic moment. Anyway, that's the founding moment of Rabbinic Judaism. Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai is the key figure in the founding of Rabbinic Judaism. And it's his cooperation with the Roman authorities. Later they become the Roman tax collectors in Palestine. So anyway, I don't want to go into all that. I'm just arguing with the Ahad. You see why I don't like him. Not that I don't like him as a person. I don't like his view of the world because I don't think it's very sophisticated. I think it's the usual what you hear, it's been told, and it's not very deeply questioned or thought out. But in any case, let's leave it, him at what he's doing. But he says here then that so he's right about that they did, but they represent the prophetic conception of Judaism. Are you kidding me? The prophetic this is nothing to do with prophecy and rabbinic Judaism and the Pharisees. It's just total nonsense what he's talking about. The Dead Sea Scrolls are all full of prophecy, so is Christianity, but not Phariseeism. They don't even hardly read the prophets. So he says, so far as turning away from life and ostracizing the state, they stuck to their post in the thick of the fray, made every possible effort to save the state from moral degeneration. That's what he's worried about. And to shape it and conform it, there it is, the spirit of the times, the zeitgeist. They're all captivated by this zeitgeist. There's a new play opening up in New York, in Lincoln Center, by Tom Stoppard, another Hungarian Jewish writer who went to England, which takes the Russian intellectuals of the 19th century, and it's supposed to be a series of 3 plays. I forget the name of the first one, but it's got rave reviews. I just heard it on NPR, they were talking about it, and they were talking about some of these intellectuals from that 19th century period who were talking about, guess who? Hegel and the zeitgeist. They're all totally obsessed with Hegel for some reason. Everybody in the 19th century is totally obsessed with him. From Karl Marx to Haram to all these different people. Anyway, he goes on to praise the Pharisees as if they cared for the state. They didn't care for the state. They didn't care about the state. They only cared, if you like, about the Torah perhaps, but not the state. And they didn't really care about the temple either. And that's why you didn't have, when the Jews went back to Israel, they didn't know what to do with the Temple Mount when they went back. I mean, Pharisee Judaism didn't want anything to do with the temple. I mean, they were just as happy not to have any priests and things to deal with. So what did Moshe Dayan do? Had no intellectual background when they caught the Temple Mount. He just gave it back to the Muslims. Well, that's fair enough if you're a nice, decent, liberal sort of person, but nobody who cared about the temple would do such a thing. And no Muslim would do such a thing for Mecca, and no Christian would do that for the Vatican or whatever. And so on, to give your most holy site back to the people who originally conquered it, that would be ludicrous. There's an article today in the Los Angeles Times by someone, if you've read it, it was who gave the other chap who was in my classes, gave me this article, this editorial from the Los Angeles Times. He was laughing in this editorial. I didn't bring it with me, but you might look at it. He was talking about how the Muslims never give up any conquered territory. They never give up any conquered territory. And that is a law in Islam. Never, once it's Islamicized, you can never give it back. They're talking about the Pope's trip to Byzantium and the churches there that have been turned into mosques and so on. They don't have any embarrassment, any of these things. But he said, either they never give anything back in this article, or when they're having a little trouble over something, then they go to the UN and they complain, meaning about Palestine and Jerusalem and so on and so forth. It was really the only article I've ever seen like that, and the person actually was very accurate in that particular assessment. They never give up anything, and when they can't get something, they go to the UN and they complain about it, which is actually what's been going on for the last 50 years. I'm not criticizing them. I mean, they're wise to do that, but in any case. The Jews, on the other hand, don't know what they're doing half the time with these things. And that's because of the problem with Pharisee Judaism. That's why I bring it up. It doesn't have a clear identity for a territorial people. It's not a religion of a territorial people. It's a religion of a diaspora. And he likes it. So, okay, fine, but we're in the background to the Sunshine movie. You know, we don't have much time left between 1900 and 1933. When's he writing this, 1905 or something? He's acting like the Jews have all the time in the world to sort all these problems out. They've got 35 years before they're all going to be annihilated. So, I mean, okay, in a peaceful time, that would be great, is discussing all these things. But to then rip down the political leader who wanted to solve these problems, I think that's, in hindsight, tragic. That's all I can tell you. This would be a great thing to be written in, like, the 17th century or 16th century when there was nobody trying to like murder you all. So anyway, he goes on like that with all these pseudo-intellectual sort of positions. But the Pharisees remembered, even in this hour of agony, that they cared for the state only for the sake of the national spirit which is embodied in the state. And we just showed you the Rabbi Yochanan, he didn't care at all about the state. He only cared about the teaching centers for Judaism, which is fine, there's nothing wrong with that. And he is true here. So the Pharisees, Torah in hand, went to Yavne. There it is, right there. I knew that was coming. The heroic birth moment of rabbinic Judaism. This is not a Zionist, you see. But he's posing as a Zionist. And that confuses the situation immensely in terms of what the Zionists finally asked for when the British are willing to give them something after World War I. Less than that. 12 years after he writes this, the British take Jerusalem and are willing to do something politically about this issue. And the leader is his disciple, Chaim Weizmann. And that is a vast tragedy for the Jewish people as far as what comes later. I think Chaim Weizmann lost his son in the RAF in World War II, and I don't begrudge him his sacrifice. But the fact of the matter is that he should not have reveled in defeating Herzl. And he should have known how to negotiate with the British in the way that Herzl would have known. And some things might have been avoided when World War II was coming. That's my point. And so when this mindset is dominating political mindset of people who are in the leadership positions, who don't feel that there's a time limit on their activity, and are more interested in cultural issues, which are noble, nothing wrong with them, but we're not, you're looking at the Sunshine Movement. You're not in a situation where cultural issues are going to matter. Anyway, I'm glad I told you about Yavne, because there it is. Anyway, the work of the Pharisees bore fruit, and they succeeded in creating a sort of shadow body politic with no roots in the solid earth. Exactly true. That is so true. That's certainly true. No roots in the shallow earth. That is true. The ghetto organizations, and this went on for 2,000 years, kept the Hebrew national spirit alive. He says, well, maybe. It's hard to, or we can't argue one way or the other, and I wouldn't want to argue with them about that. The ghetto organizations, the foundations of which were laid in the period immediately following the destruction of Jerusalem, is a miracle without parallel in human history. So we know where his heart is in the ghetto, which is fine. There's nothing wrong with it. And he thinks that's miraculous, that a people could survive in a extraterritorial state. What does Pinsker say about that? He says that people don't like ghosts. And remember that auto-emancipation? He uses medical metaphors there because he's a doctor. And he says that to everyone the Jews were like a walking dead. How come they're still around, and so on and so forth. And he called it Judeophobia. You'd have to read him in, it might be a good thing I could ask you about on these matters for an exam. Well, this is a very revealing essay. I mean, you don't have to take my view. Please don't. Just make your own view on these things. I read these things and I get very upset because I know what happened. Anyway, fine at the bottom. So the last 260. So once again, spiritually minded Jews have revived the brutal asceticism of the Essenes. Well, okay, I think that's not a bad idea, and I would agree with them like that. And for that, forget what I think. I'm just saying I don't want to be totally unfair to him. And the last paragraph, there's been a recrudescence, that would be the Haskalah, of that political materialism which sees the physical organism, the Jewish state, as the be-all and end-all of the Jewish life. Oh, no. That is a critique of Herzl. There he is subtly pouring abuse on Herzl. You see, this is the be-all and end-all for Herzl, but not for us. We don't care about the state so much. We want the culture to revive. And what he means by culture is not easy to understand. He says, both we may believe will disappear and make way for the only view that really has its roots in Judaism. The view of the prophets and the Pharisees. well, anyway, there you go. I mean, I think this guy's a nut, but that's just my own personal feeling. Forget what I think, you make your own. Now there's another lecture here. This is at the founding of the Hebrew University, or a letter to the future president of the Hebrew University, this fellow, Dr. J.L. Magnus, and you know, the Hebrew University is what a lot of people like Ahad wanted to found. He has a lot of things in here, and I'm only going to, let's look quickly here before we take a break here. The object of your society, you say, is to establish synagogues and houses of studies. We have to make the synagogue itself the house of study, with Jewish learning as first concern and prayer as secondary. So he's going on about prayer and the prayer books and so on, and then the end of that on 262. Then you say you want to propagate national religion and religious nationalism. I must confess the form is not altogether clear to me. National religion, by all means, Judaism is fundamentally national, and all the efforts of the reformers, that is, the Berlin people, to separate the Jewish religion from its national element have had no result except to ruin both nationalism and the religion. So they're all against the Berlin reformers, as you see. And he does say it is impossible at the end of that essay to be a Jew in the religious sense without acknowledging the nationality. Okay, so he is in, I'm not saying good, bad, we're talking about Zionist thinking. Is he going to be called a Zionist thinker? So he does acknowledge that kind of Zionism, if you want to call it that. Quickly, before we break, 1897, and this is right around the time when Nordau was addressing the Zionist Congress, and I think this is an attack on Nordau, the address which we read. And again, you see he doesn't like this these Westerners. Some months have passed since the Zionist Congress, when Herzl and Nordau made those speeches. Since then, the delegates have returned home. They have been calling public meetings, repeatedly regaling us with tales of the wonders that were enacted before their very eyes. The wretched, hungry public is listening, becoming ecstatic, hoping for salvation. It's inconceivable that they, the Jews from the West, you see the jealousy here and envy and dislike, can fail to succeed in what they propose. Heads grow hot, hearts beat fast. Many, quote, leaders who have had for years until last August, that is when Herzl called this convention, lived only for Palestine settlement, and for whom a penny donation in the aid of the Jewish labor in Palestine of the Jaffa School, that was the Mikveh Israel agricultural school, was worth the world, have now lost their bearings and ask one another, what's the good of this sort of work? The days of the Messiah are near, and so on and so on. I will take a break. As you see, we're getting into the thick of it here. And you see, he hates these people from the West. I'm not against or for what he's saying. It's only that I think those people could see the disaster that was coming. And he couldn't. Pick up there. 5 minutes, 10 minutes, okay?
Join. Sorry, I didn't talk.